Hi there, everyone, and thanks, Jess, for getting us started and for all the work organising. So I'm Pru Mitchell. I'm Manager of Information Services at the Australian Council for Educational Research, and ACER is pleased to be a partner with Informit for the Explore work. I'm also coming from the land of the Wurundjeri Woiwurrung people of the Kulin Nation today and pay my respect to elders past and present. Just as a little introduction to me, my background before I came to ACER was as a teacher librarian in faith-based schools, and I also spent quite a few years working in national online resources, one of which was the Global Education website, which used to be funded by AusAid through the Australian government. And there I got very deeply engaged in peace education and the global issues of our world, and how trying to fit these into the curriculum, into what is already fairly crowded curriculum. So that's really where we've come to for this webinar. Was we have been working in researching and writing some topic essays and curating resources for religious studies topics across the curriculum. This Friday this week, we mark the 10-year anniversary of the Sustainable Development Goals. We also celebrate the International Day of Peace on Friday. And this is a time when the goal of peace seems really challenging. Probably, in the whole of my teaching career, this is the time that feels the least like we're making progress in that space. There's also no escaping the fact that religion is a factor in the global conflicts that we're facing at the moment and have been throughout our history. And recognising that as educators, it's difficult, even though it's critically important, that we help students try to understand the nature and significance of religion and the influence of belief systems, the religious traditions, and how they impact individuals and society. So one of the questions, these big topics of peace and religious and cultural conflict, we're very interested in hearing from you as well at the towards the end of the session. So you can start thinking about some of the questions, letting us know what questions and concerns your students are raising, how you're engaging students in these questions, and what resources you need to be able to do this effectively. So while you think about those questions, it's my absolute pleasure to introduce Professor Peter Sherlock as our special guest today. Peter's Executive Director of the Australian Centre for Christianity and Culture and Associate Director of the Yinyamara Nguglawai Centre at Charles Sturt University. He's a historian and theologian, and his academic work has focused on cultural and religious life of Renaissance and Reformation Europe, which, at first you may not have thought that's immediately relevant to what we're talking about, but his research is all about how communities remember and forget, including the use of monuments and tombs in shaping historical consciousness, belonging and community. If you've read in the past his series In the Conversation, he's definitely not afraid to pick up on current topics and contentious topics. He's a leading expert in theological education and public engagement with religion in Australia. From 2012 to 2024, he was the Foundation Vice Chancellor of the University of Divinity. So there's a bit of background on Peter, but much better to hear it from him. So welcome, Peter, and thank you for being here. I just wonder if you'd like to tell us a bit about your background and passions and your work.
Yeah, thanks very much, Pru, and good afternoon, everyone. It's great to be with you to talk about this important topic. And as Pru said, I'm looking forward to your questions and thoughts and what your students are saying towards the end of this. So my background began in history, and then somewhat unexpectedly for the last 15 or 20 years, I've worked in the world of theology. And just in the last couple of years, that's really come to focus down on working with First Nations ways of knowing, being and doing. I'm a non-Indigenous Australian myself, but I've always been passionate as an historian about thinking about not just who we are and where do we come from, but also what are the pieces of the puzzle that tell us what our place in the world is and how we relate to other people, and how do we think about passing those ideas and that sense of belonging onto the future. So I've done that through Reformation history, and I can talk in a bit around the conflicts between Catholics and Protestants, which for Europeans is one of the primary forms of religious conflict. And I've also been doing quite a bit of work in theological education, working across different religious traditions, where now it seems like a really natural thing to do, but 50, 60, 70 years ago, it was absolutely impossible for people to even sit in the same room as each other if they came from different religious traditions. So part of my own work has been that experience of how human societies can actually change quite quickly in how they deal and think about conflict. And my latest little passion project that I'm hoping to get to in the next 5 to 10 years is a series of books about family history, which again may look like it has nothing to do with conflict, but I'm interested in how people might pick up on the passion for telling the histories of their own families as a way of thinking about how we deal with controversy, how we deal with difference in quite an intimate way in our own lives. So yeah, that's a bit about me, Pru.
Thank you. And interesting when we look at the curriculum that family history is where we start in history. I'm an early childhood educator originally, and that's where we ground that. And also most people here who are teaching religious studies in schools would, that's also a very early topic in the curriculum. So that's great to think there, that's a way forward. One of the really positive signs that I see now when I review secondary religious studies curriculum and the courses in Australia that are available is to at last see Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander spirituality is up there up front before addressing the other world religions. So I'm really keen to hear about your role as Associate Director at the Yinjimarra Nyungulawai. I hope I'm not butchering that too much. Centre, and especially the work that you and your colleagues are doing in the light of the conflict closest to home, I guess, which is the 2023 Australian Indigenous Voice referendum and the fallout from that. But yeah, it sounds like pretty inspiring work that you've got into there.
Yeah, thanks. So the Yinjimarra unit that I work for at Charles Sturt University was set up by Stan Grant, partly as he exited from a 40-year career in international journalism. And if any of you have read any of Stan's works or columns or heard him speak, you'll know his own writing and thinking is grounded in the most exceptional experiences of conflict, from, literally being as a journalist and reporter on international battlefields and seeing people die as a result of conflict, being a foreign correspondent, working across political differences, and of course, most recently as the host of Q&A in Australia, actually directly facing himself political division and racism in this country. So he brings that personal experience. And the Yinjimarra word is a Wiradjuri word for respect. And it's kind of hard to translate, but it's really about a whole ethos of what does it mean to listen before you speak, to go slowly rather than just rush at something, to go gently. So one of the things Stan now does when he speaks is he lowers his voice. So that instead of shouting at each other, whatever it is we have to say, whether it's good or bad or harsh or invitational, is said in a soft and gentle way that might help people hear. So I think you can get a bit of a feel there for what the Yinjimarra project is about, which is to take, so the Wiradjuri people are in sort of central, southern, western New South Wales, around the sort of Bathurst, down to Wagga sort of areas. And Yinjamara, really, it's not a belief system, it's not a religion, but it's the ethos which sits under so much of the Rudgery way of life. And Stan's idea, in partnership with the university, was we need a circuit breaker in our current conversations nationally and globally about how we deal with difference, about how we deal with conflict, and that maybe ancient wisdom offers a way forward. And so the Yinjamara project is largely about how do we change the conversation. So to give you a simple example, a lot of debates that we have begin with the question, who am I? Whereas Yinjamara would start with the question, where do I belong? And often in conflicts, we think, how do I change someone else's mind, or how do I respond to what someone else has done to me? In the world of Yinjamara, where there is a mutual responsibility, and this is where Stan Grant's father, Uncle Stan Grant Sr., has made a huge contribution. He's talked about Yinjamara as saying, instead, the issue we have to grapple with is that I am responsible for what you do. So instead of alienating the other and saying you sit over there and I sit over here, it's no, if you say racist things to me, I'm responsible for your actions. So I have to think about what can I change in my behavior or in our relationship that might lead to a better outcome in the way that you behave. So it's a big and challenging project, Pru, but it's incredibly exciting.
That sounds like it could take years to unpack, but yeah, very challenging. And I think later on we've got some links. So Stan's book, as a good way for us, I guess, as adults to start engaging with that kind of work. And so does that work happen mainly through publication, through professional learning? Is there any kind of way that people can get more directly involved in?
So the main way at the moment is Stan's own body of work. So he's publishing a book a year at the moment, and in anything from about the last 4 years, you'll find references to Yinjamara. And one of the great things about his current book, Mariang, A Song of Time, is that it's written in quite short, bite-sized chapters. So, it's the kind of thing you could easily take a sort of 3-page section out of, and it will tell a bit of the story and then give some of the philosophy of how might this go differently? How might we behave differently? So that's the first stage of the project. But the second stage is really to start a series of experiments, sort of public social experiments of what we call Yinjamara in action. So on some of the current anti-immigration conversations going on, what would it look like for us to hold a town hall that's your classic public debate about immigration, but invite the audience then to maybe workshop talk with each other and think about, what do I need to change, or how might I come at this differently? Because I think for me, it's a long-term project, but the urgency of it is we know what we're doing isn't working. We need a different way in.
Yeah. Taking a bit more broadly then, we describe in Australia as diverse, inclusive and multicultural, if you look at any of the curriculum documents and that kind of thing. What do you think we're successful as a multi-faith society?
Extraordinarily so. Australia is just, notwithstanding all of our problems and challenges, is one of the most exceptional places on earth, compared to the way societies operated 50, 100, 200 years ago. The ability for such an extraordinary mix of people on their culture, language, religion, is almost unique in human history. And there are a few other nations, I think, around the world that have been able to achieve what we've achieved here. And I think, of course, it's at risk. It's not stable. There are many challenges to that way of life, and individually and collectively, many of us still experience forms of exclusion. But the simplest example I've got was, my mum talks about when she goes to school, she was brought up in a Protestant family. You threw rocks at the Catholic kids on your way home and vice versa, because that's just what you did. And it's like, on the whole, as far as I know, that doesn't happen anymore. And so that's a big change. And I think the multi-faith part of that has partly been through a lot of affirmative work done. So, well beyond Christian religions now at a civic level. And, some of that is um, at simplistic, there's the old adage, we do parties and we do food, and that's where we find the basis to share. But, actually, what's life about? When you get down to it, it's about parties and it's about sharing food with each other. So I think that's okay. So I live in the city in Melbourne, and whether it's the Chinese New Year festival, whether it's a Buddhist festival, whether it's knowing that it's Ramadan and some of my colleagues are fasting, whatever it is, just that awareness that we bring different experiences and beliefs into the same shared public space, and that probably 95% of the time it coheres, that's really, really successful. What worries me is the voices emerging that suggest maybe that invitation to be at a shared table and bring the richness of our lives is maybe being taken off the table by some people, but that might be for a bit later in the conversation, Pru.
Yes, well, I think it's probably front of everyone's mind, and we certainly hearing anecdotally about people who know about they enjoy the food, enjoy the festivals, but actually don't have much idea of where they come from, and also a bit of criticism in the school sector that yes, that's what we do. We have Harmony Day, and that's the only occasion when we have any opening to encourage that kind of conversation in schools about where people are coming from. But maybe if we just jump back to history, as as a historian, what can we learn? You talked about the Catholic Protestant question, but where are the other things that we could be looking at and learning from, and making sure our students are learning from?
Yeah. So, I mean, there's probably, a couple of sides to that at least. I think one for me is some of my original historical training was in 17th century English constitutional history, which sounds unbelievably boring, but actually it's a story of a whole series of, civil war and conflict. They executed the monarch Charles I. But through that process, English society worked out how were we going to organise ourselves, how are we going to govern ourselves. So you get ideas literally invented in the late 17th century, like habeas corpus, the right not to be arrested without knowing what the charges against you are. Really extraordinarily bedrock notions that sit under what it means to be a democracy. And you can't understand that period of history without understanding the religious conflict between Catholics and Protestants that drove it. So I'm always going to advocate that therefore we need, in a crowded curriculum, we do have to find ways to talk about some of those old conflicts. So one example that when I was teaching Reformation history in theological colleges to seminarians, you'd have like Catholics, Protestants, Orthodox in the same room studying the history of this period, and the Orthodox were like, "What is this Reformation thing about? Why did you guys do this?" And the Catholics and the Protestants were suddenly understanding, "I had no idea we did that to you." So it kind of went back a bit to that Injamata idea I was talking about of what does it mean to look at the history of the Reformation and be honest about our own positions today. And often for non-believers in the class, they were like, why would people be willing to die for what seems to us an incredibly esoteric or minor point of doctrinal difference that we can barely understand today? And so I always had to push back on that and say, look, Christian martyrdom, the willingness to die for your faith or for the correct version of your faith, is a huge part of the story of Christianity from the last 2,000 years. But the thing I found challenging about the Reformation was not the willingness to die. It was what the historian Brad Gregory has called the willingness to kill. So in the 16th and 17th centuries, when Mary I in England burned Protestants at the stake, and the Catholic Church went along with that, it was the church that was doing it. It was a Christian monarch who was propagating violence against other people who said they were Christian. And I think, and that's the key ingredient. You know, what leads people to be willing to kill other human beings in the name of religion, and that's a very difficult issue we have to confront. But you can't confront it by saying, "Oh, they didn't know." You know, we don't believe that stuff anymore. You actually do have to understand the detail of it. And it plays out in all sorts of other contexts. The Protestant Catholic one is, you know, well known to people of, say, British or Western European descent. But I'm conscious in Australia, you know, we have extraordinary levels of immigration from places like India and Pakistan, you know, Bangladesh. And of course, you know, what happened in the subcontinent of Asia in the 1940s and 50s was partition, where you have, you know, hundreds of millions of people shifted on account of political and largely religious differences, and millions of people killed. And that trauma is still sitting there in our society. It's just that people don't often know very much about it. So again, I'm like, we have to attend to that, because these traumas, these differences, they stay with us. And if we don't understand them and unravel them a little bit, you know, it'll come back to haunt us.
I think most people here probably, you know, have that experience of things. They also becomes intergenerational. You realise that you hold this idea because your parents somehow, you know, relate it to you, and you've taken it on. And it's not till somebody asks that very question, you know, how did you know, why did that happen, that you realise what you've been carrying around.
Yeah, and sometimes, and this is where my work on forgetting as well as remembering is really important, sometimes it's things that we don't talk about, or that you've only caught a little piece of, and you know there's something there, but because we, you know, nature abhors a vacuum, so what you don't know sometimes, you know, can become a source of anger and conflict. Yep.
And this must be playing out in classrooms all the time, you know, when you've got such a diverse range of students coming from different families and different experiences, whether you're in a faith-based school where you might think, you know, you've got more similarity. We do, you know, we know that there are lots of, yeah, we've still got the same societal makeup of, and so you'll have a diverse cultural and religious group and heritage. I think we're nearly at time when we need to engage people, but just want to address protests, because students in particular, I think this is, you know, a really hot topic. They're participating in protests or seeing others participate in protests every weekend in their cities. For some of them, maybe this is the only time they're actually getting any education about the issues and religious conflict. But I just wonder what your thoughts are about the effectiveness of protest marches, the impacts on students of being active in-person marching or online. We know that, you know, students are also engaging online in this kind of space. So yeah, any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I have a number, and I hope anything I say doesn't offend anybody. And if I do cause offence, please don't hesitate to ask a question or put something in the chat, and I'm more than happy to, you know, to listen to you and try and respond. But I think my overview comment is that it's no surprise that the what feels like a loss of social cohesion and unraveling is happening now in the wake of a pandemic. So, you know, the rise of Hitler's Germany, the Great Depression, the Second World War, you can actually trace lots of threads back to the global flu pandemic of 1919, when people were forced into all sorts of social restrictions, and some of that negative energy goes somewhere. So I think my first comment is we just have to be aware there is actually that context here. And again, people don't want to talk about the pandemic. We want to forget it. It's too traumatic. But actually, that's, I think, one thread playing into the current situation. And I suspect our students are incredibly traumatized by those events because of what it did to their life and their education at an incredibly formative period. So that's my first point. I think the second one is that there's been, I live in the centre of Melbourne, so I see there are literally at least 2 protests every weekend, and it's been that way for at least the last 3 or 4 years. So there's a kind of protest exhaustion coming on. And one of the things that I thought was very powerful about I think what they call it the March for Australia rally in Melbourne 2 weeks ago, was that they'd kind of finally realised, no, save it up. Like, don't just do these endless protests with 20 or 30 people. Actually get 10,000 people out together, and it makes a huge impact. So I think there's a protest fatigue phenomenon going on, and that has, while, like, to be honest, it's really inconvenient that I can't just catch the tram up my street to do my shopping or whatever, and I know that's not strictly speaking relevant. It is also getting in just the way of people living their daily lives. So it feels like it's causing this nitpicking underlying frustration that I think again gives us that sense of instability, and the inability to sit down and have a conversation instead of a few people shouting at a few other people. The third piece is, so the two protest marches a couple of weeks ago actually met outside my apartment building in Melbourne, so I couldn't get out of my own building, had to nick out the car park out the back way. And it was, I mean, I wasn't frightened for my own safety, but I was very frightened for the protesters and for the police, because there was missiles starting to be thrown, and it could have got extremely nasty, and thank God it didn't. But I was sort of pondering what was the outcome here, because you had two sides that were quite opposed to each other. They were baiting each other with what they were saying, rightly or wrongly. I admire people standing up for a point of principle, for what they believe in. But I wasn't sure that there was anything productive that could come of the two protest marches kind of hitting each other. So, and I'll tell one more story before you may want to push me through about, what do we actually do. I was then in Sydney last weekend for work, and I just went to I actually went to the art gallery, and I sat down in Hyde Park and I had a coffee at a cafe. It was glorious Sydney morning, the sun was shining, and I suddenly realised that at the same cafe, all queuing up, were the police in their high-vis vests and the protesters carrying, upside down Australian flags and One Nation t-shirts and anti-voice referendum, all the rest of it. And everyone was lining up in the sun, getting their coffee, their soft drink, whatever, and frankly, having a pretty good time. And there was a side of me that said, why couldn't we just sit down at a table, have a coffee and a croissant? And we were being served by women of Asian Australian descent, which sort of stuck with me. Why couldn't we sit down and actually talk it out before we started shouting at each other? And that again takes me back to that Injamara space. And then I thought, okay, what could I have done differently? And so I saw this woman walking towards me with a T-shirt that said, and then the people said no, the end. There was a comment on the referendum. And I actually realised what I should have done if I'd been brave is I should have gone up to her and said, really quietly and politely, could you tell me a bit more about what that T-shirt means to you and why you're wearing it? And would you mind if I gave you a hug? I don't agree with you, but I just think we need to start acting a bit differently. Now, I'm a white guy. I can get away with some of that. The thing that shocked me then was that I saw near the art gallery 3 young white guys wearing swastikas on their sleeve. And again, I never thought I'd see that in Australia. How do I respond? And again, I wish I had been a little bit braver and just again gently gone up to them and said, could you tell me a little bit about why you're wearing that armband and where you think this is going? Just as a way to give them a chance to voice what they wanted to say, but hopefully quietly and gently, and give you a chance to be heard in the spirit of sort of diffusing the situation. So that, Pru, is kind of where I'm heading at the moment, and I know that's not for everybody. And the tension I think we have to hold together is how do we acknowledge the importance of what we call free speech, freedom of belief, freedom of thought, and the right to express that? How do we hold that together with our obligation as a society to actively reach out to each other and reach across the boundaries, however huge the gulf may seem, to try and start the conversation that takes us somewhere else?
That's a wonderful challenge, and thank you. And I think teachers who have a good rapport with their students have a way into this. If we can having those conversations, you're in a safer space. Maybe there's a bit of a power differential, so whether you actually get the opportunity, even you may invite the conversation, but I would I'd really welcome anyone who would like to either put some ideas in the chat, or feel free to raise your hand and ask questions directly, or give suggestions. I mean, as I say, one of the things we're keen to know is, where are your students sitting? Where are you sitting in this kind of conversation as educators? And where can what are the questions that your students are asking? If anyone's ready to do that. Oh, Lucky's got a okay. All right, they're coming in the chat, so let me read one and then give you a chance to respond, Peter. But welcome at this stage if we want to open up and anyone else wants to put their hand up to give their ideas, that's good. But Lucky's got in first. What's a good way for teachers to handle a situation if students clash over religious or cultural views in class?
Yeah, so I'm going to be teaching teachers how to suck eggs
Yeah.
now. But I think the first thing is, you've got to have some boundaries in place about rules of engagement. And I'm curious. So I'm an optimist. I'm a great believer in the power of people to bring the good forth out of people. But is it possible in the classroom to get the students themselves to talk about, can they set the rules for engagement, and then say, okay, hopefully that comes up with, no violence, softly spoken, being short and to the point, and being able to express yourself very clearly, on the principle of do no harm to others. So, racist, sexist, homophobic language is out of place, but it's still okay to express doubt or to ask questions or put a different point of view. Now, that's not something that's done quickly or simply, but I think anything we can do to train students and give them the ability to shape their reality, to shape that conversation without just repressing those views. Because my worry at the present time is that repression strategy just means they'll break out in the playground, at home, in the protests or whatever. Yeah.
Yes, definitely. Billy, as a person of colour, also living in Melbourne, yeah, can you can
I'm
see
reading
those
this
chats?
too.
Yeah, thanks.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah, again,
yeah,
Billy, thanks, and that's the thing that breaks my heart about these conversations. Because, as I said, I'm generally not afraid for my own safety as a reasonably fit white guy. But what really appalled me in the Melbourne CB was watching all of the other people who either probably should have been a bit more worried about their own safety because it was such a volatile situation, and absolutely no, you do not walk up to those groups and start a gentle conversation. Only certain people can do that. So I think you've got to put your own safety first, absolutely. But I think the you've put your finger on the point here, which is, yes, we need to find ways to get our students to talk to each other across those boundaries, and to be aware of what is the difference between um, um, looking after your own safety emotionally and physically, but also being able to have an ear open to the question, um, this is what these people are saying. And of course, this is one of the problems with some of the protests we're seeing at the moment. Their shopping list of demands is not always clear, but it's asking people to reflect on, why do you think they're saying that? What things might be sitting under it? What is the brokenness or the hurt or the harm that might be sitting under for that person? And also then having the boundaries, and this is where great teachers come into play. Sometimes you need to stop asking that question because it is going to be harmful for you. But again, this is the Yinjamana piece. This is actually a fundamental piece around Christianity, in particular, which is the religion I know best, is about being able to understand what's sitting underneath this thing for the other person that I do not understand or that I actually find harmful.
yes, and I think that's a good point about what finding out actually what the issues are is part of the challenge sometimes. And in the school situation, I guess that comes back to, what's dear to my heart, which is, media literacy, information literacy. How do you actually, what is the evidence behind this belief or this concern? But we know that doesn't necessarily change the hearts and minds part, but at least, it's we've hopefully meeting at some point where there are some facts in this whole question. We've got another question, Rachel. Oh, okay. I don't know, Rachel, whether you want to give us any more context for your question, what kind of situation you're working in?
I'm just going to jump in here quickly. Just wondering, Pru, we might want to read out the questions just for the benefit of anyone watching the recording.
Sorry, yes.
No, that's all right. So just for anyone who is watching this at some point in the future, Rachel's question was, are there any methods, techniques, tools that you would recommend for teaching this type of content in a predominantly monoculture classroom?
Yeah, look, a couple of thoughts. And of course, it will depend a bit on what the monoculture is. So I don't make any assumptions about that. But even if it's just say gender, it's a boys' school or a girls' school. I think it's attending to, I think we can't dodge anymore that we have to find a way of introducing difference into the classroom. So the first thing is for people to realise there is not one way to think about it. Let me give you a very simple example. I was in a university tute that I was taking about 20 years ago on, of all people, Elizabeth I. And I had this amazing group of women. It was an all-female tutorial, quite unusually in history and gender studies. And they were doing the thing before the class of having a fantastically riveting conversation. And then as soon as the class started, they'd all shut up. And they got on to feminism and they started doing the whole, oh, I'm not a feminist, but, in my life, I've never experienced discrimination as a woman. And I let this go on for a bit. And finally, I said to them, what would you say to someone who had experienced discrimination because of their gender? And it was like the sort of scales fell off their eyes because like these women recognised most of them came from largely privileged backgrounds, and it had never occurred to them in 18 years of high quality education to ask the question, maybe feminism was about doing something for other people, not about whether I was being personally discriminated against. And I'm hoping some of them went out and have subsequently started to change the world. I'm sure they have. But the thing I took away from that, Rachel, was first, people needed to see a different perspective. Now, you can do that by what I do, take them to the 16th century, take them to the other side of the world to a completely different culture that maybe people can start to see the multiple points around a particular issue. That's one thing. And then the second thing is then to work out how do you solve that problem again as a group of students. And again, I believe in the power of students. Do the mini parliament, the mini cabinet meeting thing. What would you do to solve the problem so that we start actively engaging with the difference is not just going to go away. You can't wish it out of existence. So how do we negotiate that as a community? So I think the empathy point is really significant, but so is the simple point, whatever the difference is, whether it's religious, cultural, ideological, students have to start getting the techniques and the ability to work with that. Yeah.
Yeah, so it may mean having to research for themselves those other contexts, or giving them an activity that involves them taking a different stance. But
and I hate to say good old-fashioned debating is one way to do that, and that doesn't actually work for everyone. I think the other thing that I've been thinking more, and Rachel, I'm kind of making this up on the run because it's a very life journey. I don't now like the idea that the students individually go and do that exercise. It's something about the group, because again, that's the social problem we're facing. So how can we wrestle with that together in the classroom as a group? Yeah.
Kim's given this comment about an article that came out recently, "We Are Clueless, the voices of Jordanian teachers untrained in conflict-sensitive pedagogy," and wondering how you would respond to comments that students hear from parents or images on the news about Ukraine or Gaza. So obviously, going right to where people are and what they're seeing. So I think we've kind of touched on it, but we could perhaps, if you want to jump into those two specifically.
Yep. Thanks for taking us, Kim, right to the heart of the matter. Hey. Yeah, so where would I start? I think in both situations, I would need to start with two realities that sit in conflict with each other. One is that there will very likely be people in your classrooms who have lost relatives in either conflict. that's a very, very difficult thing where that happens. And there will be people in the classroom who may have family on the other side of the conflict. So those are, for me, that's the starting point of finding a way to acknowledge those two realities. And again, forgive me if I sound offensive, but some of it's banal. You hear people make public statements about, well, it was Hamas, it wasn't the Palestinians, or we have to acknowledge what happened to the Israelis as well as what happened to the Gazans. And I think it needs a bit of care, because there's got to be a genuineness in that recognition that there are multiple points of view that have led people to death. So that's a hard truth. So I think the first thing is saying is somehow bringing that to light. And then I think in that context, again, there should be a way. So having created that recognition, does that provide enough of a safe space to gently help people question the comments that they're hearing, whether it's, from the news, from social media, and ask that question, what are the other points of view here? Where that can get slippery is that I don't, so I do actually believe that there is truth. I don't, there are not just multiple viewpoints that all coexist. No, I'm sorry. Some viewpoints are more true than others. So you have to find a way to hang on to that. But again, I wonder in the current context, is that the conversation that we want students to have? Where do you locate truth? And what do you do when someone's locates truth in a different place to yourself? So again, I want to come back to that wisdom of Injamara, which I see, again, very much aligned with many of the mainstream world religions, is that it forces us to ask, not an eye for an eye or a tooth for tooth, but love your neighbour as you would love yourself. And how am I responsible for where you locate truth? What does it mean to live in a world where I see your truth? Personally, I can't stomach doing that with Vladimir Putin or Bibi Netanyahu right now, but I can do it for the Russian mother whose son has been forced to go to war in Ukraine. I can do it for the Israeli Reserve Army member who is being called up and wants to say no. So it's finding a story, it's finding a pattern, it's finding a way through to help that engagement. So Kim, I hope I've got some way towards your question.
Thanks, Peter. That's, like, obviously if there was an answer, it would, we wouldn't be here, but I think it's really helpful to hear, to look at the little bits that we can pick up.
Can I add maybe one more comment? I just want to go back to my story. Why can't we just sit down and have a coffee and croissant together? Now, I know at one level that's not true, but it also points us to different ways of acting and behaving. So, the most moving thing I have done this year by a long shot was the Collins Street Baptist Church a couple of weeks ago hosted a vigil at which they read out the names of the 18,500 Israeli and Palestinian children, people under 18, who have been killed since October the 7th, 2023. And it took them 30 hours with groups of volunteers. And all I did was they read out the name of the person and their age. And of course, they said zero so many times, like it was absolutely gut-wrenching, heartbreaking stuff. But what it did was it made those people real. Each of them was a human being that you could suddenly connect to, rather than, these global figures we couldn't. And there was no political speeches, no protest. There was prayer and people were lighting candles, and that was it. And I was struck by the simplicity of that as an alternative course of action. It just created a different space. So again, how do we create the different space in the classroom where maybe something else could happen? And conversely, I sing in the choir at St Paul's Cathedral in Melbourne, and for the first time in living memory, we had to hold our service a couple of Sundays ago behind locked doors because the police said it's just not safe to leave your doors open with the protesters outside. And I thought, gee, this is like suddenly going to where so much of the rest of the world has lived without freedom of religion, that we can't actually conduct public worship. And yet I thought, it's still important to come here and sing this service as a different form of living.
Yeah, I think that that takes it back to that that whole thing about place, and that was a kind of bit of an eye opener when people start saying, "Oh, I don't go to the city now." That kind of stopping people from doing things. Sarah's got an equally difficult question. What could you say to students who are indifferent or apathetic to the world and humanitarian conflicts as they don't impact them? And I guess that's another issue that we're facing, you know.
That I think that so I always joke, and again, forgive me if I offend you, everyone's religious in the sense of everyone has a God, an ultimate value. Everyone has something that actually drives their behavior. One of the reasons why religions often get a bad name is that what we say that value is and what we actually do, when you get that hypocrisy, it undermines credibility. So the students who are indifferent or apathetic do actually have a value system that is operating. In the case of the way, Sarah, that you put it, it's this doesn't affect me. Sometimes you just can't change it, right? That's okay, and it's not your job as a teacher, in a sense, to completely shake up the world, but you mostly do it. What I would say is there a way that you can simply call attention to that value system without criticism? Is it true to say, can a student come to that point of view? Yes, I've realised that for me, I just don't care about anybody else. It's all about me. And I'm optimistic. I think ultimately that is not, in fact, the case. The problem is that the value system in which we sit in Australia at the present time means that the primary values for most people are making sure I can provide food and shelter, and a comfortable life for my family, for my children, for my parents, and maybe have a better life than the previous generation is possibly the dominant value. So it's okay to tease out that that's what's happening here, and suddenly what's going on in Ukraine or Gaza may seem like it doesn't matter. And politically, that sometimes becomes important because suddenly actually we know through climate change, through economic and political instability, that fundamental value actually is a threat. It's likely that the next generation is not going to have a more comfortable life than the previous one. So there is the beginnings of conversation there. Sarah, perhaps sometimes we just kind of have to accept it too.
Okay, Peter, very, very grateful for your time. Just one more call for people, also aware it's the end of a long day for people who've been teaching. But are there any other questions or anyone else wanting to share, particularly around, whether you have anything planned for this week and, teaching peace? So just draw attention further up in the chat to where Jessica shared some links, both Peter's work and Stan Grant's work, and there's a Uniting Church International Day of Peace resource there that may be useful for people looking at liturgies or class activities. But if not, I will just say, oh, here we go, children's books on peace. Yes, we can certainly send those out with the resources at the end. There's a Peace Prize of children's books, and there will be book lists around. I didn't know, Peter, if you wanted to jump in on anyone in particular, but
nothing further to add on that one.
No,
sorry.
We'll follow up on that. Reshare the links. Oh, okay. Yes, Jessica will send them out with the recording.
I'll make sure everyone gets those links in a follow-up email along with the PowerPoint slides and the recording as well. So you'll have everything you need.
Peter, thank you so much. That was just really interesting, and it was so good to hear your expertise and the wisdom across so many different areas. Really engaging. Thank you. And just to everyone who came along, thank you. Please think about how you're going to apply things from this conversation in your work, in your life. Act now for a peaceful world is the theme for International Day of Peace. And so I think if we all start from where we are and try and move this conversation out into your classrooms and your staff rooms, that would be a wonderful outcome. So big thank you, Peter.
My pleasure. Thanks, Pru.